Hey everyone, it's Motzie. Today we're going to be doing a special episode for Pride Month. It's something I wanted to do for a while, but decided to do it this year because Pride Month this year has been very, very busy for me, and despite all of the really cool episodes we got coming up for the scripted side, I need time, and I don't want to leave you all hanging. I don't want to leave you all without an episode this week, so I thought it'd be the perfect time to do the Pride special for 2026. This is not the same as the Pride episode for 2026, but it's something I wanted to do as a bonus feature, and it's something that a lot of listeners seem to want, so I'm happy to do it. So in this episode, we're actually going to be chatting about the queer identities of the characters in Hainai. I made a joke Pride post this week about how it's easier to name all of the non-queer characters in Hainai, the cis-hetero characters, the cisgender heterosexual characters in Hainai, and I was pretty much able to go through the entire series and name all of the cis-hetero characters in one post. So that's not even a joke. I can name the cis-hetero characters in Hainai faster than I can name all of the queer characters in Hainai. So it was a fun episode idea to actually name the queer characters and talk about them, their queer identities, and how they identify, if they do at all, and a little bit about their history, their romantic history, and their history as queer characters. So I wanted to start off, obviously, with our main characters. We've got the main five, who are all queer, but in different ways. So let's start off with Mary, obviously. Mary is pansexual. I've talked about that in a lot of posts about her. Basically, she falls in love with anybody, but in the past, she actually has only dated women. And Donner is the first guy that she's actually dated. And I've mentioned this before. I've even jokingly mentioned how it's yes, it is the closed off, stoic old man in a young man's body that made Mary fall madly in love. And I like it because I want to portray how love can be a weird spectrum. It's what you love in a certain gender is not always going to be the same throughout. People are complicated, and Mary is complicated, and what she finds attractive in women is going to be different from what she finds attractive in men or non-binary people. And that is portrayed very heavily with her choice in partners. Obviously, Laura and Donna are completely different people, although they do have some overlap in how they are very determined and how they care deeply and will happily risk their lives. Well, maybe not happily, but will risk their lives for the people that they love. And jumping off of that, another aspect of Mary's queerness is that she is also polyamorous. She talks about this with Laura, when she tells her that they can absolutely be in a relationship, although Laura says, you gotta talk to Donna about this. But yeah, Mary has always been polyamorous, and she even discusses how, in her previous relationship with her ex-girlfriend Ira in the Philippines, she was monogamous for Ira's sake, but not for her own sake. Basically, in the relationship, Ira was not comfortable with polyamory, and so Mary accepted that, and they were fine with it. That's kind of what happens in relationships. You talk about things, and even though Mary is explicitly polyamorous, she put a lid on that for Ira, and then they broke up, and now she's, with Donner and Laura, and I think they've discussed it as well in the show, where Donner is he hasn't really given it a lot of thought, and what thought he has given is that maybe emotionally, he's not super, down with the idea of polyamory, but at the same time, he says, well, it's Laura, and it's because of what they've gone through, he has no issue with this at all. In fact, he kind of expected Mary to be with Laura, and so mentally and emotionally, he's this is correct, this is right. And I think that adds a little nuance, because, just because they have a polyamorous relationship in this show doesn't mean, it's going to be magically okay for everybody. In this case, yes, because, they've gone through a lot together. And that's part of the reason that Donner's yes, absolutely, I want Mary to be with Laura, and vice versa. Laura has not discussed her feelings about polyamory because she is the third person in this relationship, at least chronologically. But if we had a discussion about Laura, I would think that she is a little more open to polyamory. I think she's thought about it more than Donner has, because Donner has not really given much thought to romance in general, let alone polyamory. But I think Laura, with her relatively healthy dating life, has given it some thought and is down with it. That's just my thought process about it. They never actually have the discussion on an episode because, we've kind of moved on to other things in the plot. But I do think that Laura is okay with Donna and Mary, and, it's not a huge deal to her. I mean, it's a huge deal in the fact that she's very emotional about this relationship, but other than that, Laura is accepting. Donner is accepting because of circumstances, but emotionally speaking, I don't think he'd be okay with it if it was not Laura, if that makes sense. And with that, I want to jump into Laura. So we know that Laura is a lesbian. That has been mentioned even in the descriptions of Hainai. She is the 6'2" tall lesbian with an axe. We need to give her axe more often. I feel like I have failed to provide her with opportunities to use her axe. But yeah, Laura is the sunshiny 6'2" lesbian, and I've been pretty open about that. Laura has only dated women. In my mind, Laura has had many relationships in the past, high school, college. But when she moved, I don't think that any of her relationships moved with her. And I don't know if she's friendly with any of her exes. But, Laura's had a relatively normal dating life, and with Mary, that is the least normal relationship that she's had, but also the strongest relationship that she's had. There is something to be said about trauma bonding, but there's also something to be said about the fact that Laura just has been in love with Mary since almost the beginning of the series. And we have, we've hinted at it, we've joked about it, we've talked about how Laura and Mary almost went on a date, and they were both, pretending that it wasn't, and, and pretending that they would never get together. And, that threw a lot of people off, but I do think a lot of people still got the vibes as time went on. And the vibes were there because Donner was like, oh, they're gonna get together, and then was shocked when Mary confessed to him. Not that shocked. He knew Mary had feelings for him, but he was like, no, but her and Laura are so perfect for each other. And so that's what happened in the relationship. But yeah, Laura is just, she is sort of the beating heart of this group. I know Mary is sort of the center in terms of what they're trying to do as a mission, but Laura is the emotional center because Laura is the one who keeps the entire series from turning into just the darkest shit imaginable. Laura is the reason that this show is not tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy, even though there are tragedies in this show. Oh, and I do want to mention that Laura, I think you could tell that Laura had feelings for Mary around the time that Abe was around, because Laura was kind of joking around about Abe having a huge crush on Mary, but I think you could tell that she was kind of a little bit uncomfortable with it too, and, the hints have always been there, but I think could have been well interpreted as just Laura being a good friend, but at the end of the day, it's been building since the beginning of the series, and I was kind of going back and forth on whether it would be reciprocated, but then at the end of the day I decided, well, I want to write a story where I see myself represented in some way, and I am polyamorous, but not in practice. You'd have to be dating to do that. Anyway, yeah, it's something that I want to see in stories, because I love love, and I love seeing how, relationships can be done even with a lot of difficulty, and polyamory is a relationship where there is a lot more, logistically speaking, to handle. And I find that really interesting from a writing romance and writing love perspective. And I love queer love, so, that's part of that as well. And now we jump over to Donner, who is a very interesting case because we know he's queer. He was in love with Carl Morgan when he was younger, and of course he fell in love with Murphy and Mary, so we know that he has queer feelings. However, because of the nature of his work and the nature of his trauma and the nature of what he's gone through, he has not labeled himself. He does not have a label. And I think that's an interesting aspect of queer identity that we have to acknowledge, which is that some people simply have no label to define themselves with, and they don't want one. And I always found those people to be very interesting and cool, and I say cool, but what I mean is that there is a certain level of confidence, but also knowing yourself, to know that you're not really going to seek out a label, even knowing that you are not, within the traditional structure of being cisgender or heterosexual. And of course, Donner is cisgender. All these characters have been. But it is really interesting. Donner knows who he loves, and that's all that matters to him. He will not really identify by any sort of flag color. He will not identify by any sort of identity or label. But he knows who he loves, and he knows who he has loved. And so we can call him queer just to show that, he has had relationships and he has been in love with different sorts of people, different genders of people. But he himself is comfortable without a label, and so when I talk about the characters, I talk about how Mary is pansexual, I talk about how Laura is a lesbian, I talk about how Murphy is gay and Ashvin is bisexual, but then when we get to Donner, he is who he is, without a label, with all the love that he has, and I think that's beautiful. And like I said, with his life, he hasn't given romance much thought, he's kind of pushed it away, so he's also the kind of person who has not really given it much consideration. Maybe in the future he'll be comfortable with a certain label, but for now, he is labelless, and he is part of this beautiful tapestry of queerness, where he will simply not pick a label, he will not pick a flag, but he's there with everyone else because of who he loves. And speaking of who he loves, we're going to talk about Murphy. Now, we know that Murphy is gay, and we know that being gay has given him a lot of freedom, from the life that he lived before. And Murphy has a very traditional story, I think, in my mind. He was a gay man who was estranged from his family, his very strict family, who had all of these expectations of him, who basically drove him out with their expectations. And Murphy, unfortunately, as a teenager, left, went to Toronto, and became homeless. And Donner helped him back on his feet. And so his love for Donner was at first built on a lot of sort of codependency, a lot of like feeling like he owed Donner. On the other hand, eventually, when he stopped feeling like he had to owe Donner things, that's when Donner was more open to his feelings. But by that point, he was already with Ashvin, so Donner had kind of given up on it. But, eventually they finally talked about their feelings, which, long overdue. 15 years of Murphy harboring feelings for Donner, and they finally talked about it. They're finally, at this point in their relationship where they understand each other's feelings, but we have not gone further about whether they're together, what they're doing. We just know that they have finally discussed and are open about their feelings, and will perhaps put a pin in that while all of the supernatural stuff is going on. I promise that I know exactly where their relationship will end up in the future, but for now we don't actually get to know what they've discussed past the episode where they finally confess to each other. That one is for them for now, and I will continue to talk about it later on. In part because, their personalities. These are the type of guys who took 15 years to confess to each other and had to have other partners egg them on to confess to each other and actually talk to each other and be open to each other. And so, on their own, do you believe that they have the power to just sit down and have a normal conversation about the relationship? Uh, I don't know. But, obviously they are at this point where they've always had this trust and love for each other. They've always loved each other. That's not been in question. They have been buddy cops. They have been partners for 15 years. They have been partners for a long time. And so a lot is unsaid. Although what was unsaid did hurt them for a little while. But there is a lot that's unsaid that makes them very cohesive as a partnership. And so even after this confession and them knowing each other's feelings, they have to put some things aside for now so that they can focus on quote-unquote the mission, but also they are comfortable in understanding that they do love each other and that love has grown or has a different dimension to it now. And so their relationship is very fascinating to me, and I will absolutely cover a little bit more about it in the future, but for now, just assume that after that really heartfelt and tragic discussion about, their relationship and their feelings for each other, not much has happened by way of, like with Mary, she has been sleeping in the bed with Laura every now and then. They've been going on little dates. Like, it's not covered, but you can kind of tell that they've been spending more time together. Whereas with Donner and Mary, they literally slept together at one time, and also they act like a couple as well. So they have a very established sort of like couple dynamic now, Mary and Donner, and then Mary and Laura. However, Donner and Murphy, we don't get to know what their new dynamic is yet, and I will be sprinkling a little bit of it over time, but they are not emotionally open people, and so it's going to be a little more difficult for them. I will definitely go into that, though. And speaking of emotionally open, we've got Ashvin. I know, it seems like a weird segue because Ashvin does not immediately seem like he's emotionally open, but if you remember, he is actually the one who told Murphy that, like, he wanted a real relationship. Like, everything in his life is so fake that he wants something real, and he is actually very emotionally open when it comes to relationships. And as I mentioned already, Ashvin is bisexual. Actually, a little aspect of Ashvin's character that I did not go into is that at one point I wanted to introduce in a side episode that Ashvin had an ex-girlfriend. And actually an ex-girlfriend that he had a good relationship with. The way that it was is that they were both super catty people. Like, they kept insulting each other. They would, like, greet each other and say the harshest, bitchiest things to each other, but then hug and kiss and be like, oh, I missed you so much. Like, that was the relationship that they had. Basically, like, two catty people, two extremely bitchy people who actually loved each other. And the reason that they broke up is not necessarily because they stopped loving each other, but because they realized they were better off as friends. And I had this idea that she would come back into his life briefly just to meet Murphy. But of course, that is more a rom-com plot than it is a horror podcast plot, so that fell by the wayside. But yes, Ashvin had an ex-girlfriend. They're both very similar. They love each other, but as friends. And Ashvin himself is a very interesting case where in every relationship that he's had, he would usually find it in relatively shallow places. So he's trying to find depth in shallow places, if that makes sense. He would cruise in bars. He would go to these parties. Basically, his job made it so that a lot of his life was very shallow. But in so doing, he wanted his relationships to be much deeper. And so it was an interesting contrast with how Ashvin is. He's a con man, he's a liar, but at the same time, he wanted something true and real and honest in his relationships. And I think that him and Murphy getting together was very much just flirtation, getting to bed together, kind of just something that was meant to be a one-night stand, but then Murphy, who does not admit that he wants something deeper, got really caught up in Ashvin, who will absolutely admit he wants something deeper, but then sort of trap you by making it seem like he wants something shallow at first, and then by the time you've caught feelings, it's too late. Obviously not literally trapped, but you get the idea. Ashvin wants something deep, wants something real, and he's also very intuitive because he does have to lie to people a lot, but that means that he can read them very well. And he immediately clocked that, Murphy had feelings for Donner, but it was complicated, and he still loved Murphy, and Murphy still loved him, and so he was willing to sort of deal with the mess, especially after, all the supernatural stuff started coming in, and he's like, well, I guess I'm stuck with these people. I will do my best. Ashvin is lovely. Ashvin is really a fun character that does tend to be relegated to the sidelines every now and then, but every time he's in the story, he is a delight, and everyone loves him. And I will briefly mention Evelyn Wai, our favorite archivist. Our favorite part of the Polycule, who's not part of the Polycule. She is the honorary sixth member of the main cast, and, they have sort of adopted her as a younger sibling type person. And also, she is incredibly helpful when it comes to research. She really wants to help in every way possible. And we have joked that of all the characters in Hainai who could become a Magnus Archives archivist, and Evelyn Wai would be the top choice, but she would be more of a Gertrude than a Jonathan Sims. So she would be way too, competent for the job. And I know this is not talking about her, queer identity, but still. Anyway, Evelyn is a biromantic asexual. She's much younger than the other characters, and as a college student has had time to sort of think about her identity, explore herself, and basically figured out that yes, she is asexual, but she's not aromantic, she's actually biromantic, and may actually get into a relationship one day, but in the meantime, her hyperfixation on research and finding out the truth about the elders is what's taking up her time, and maybe in the future, whatever relationship she gets into, will accept that this is a big part of her life, and this is kind of just what she's doing. And I've made a joke before that, she's technically an ancillary part of the Polycule, but as an archivist. So, not as a part of the Polycule, per se, but as sort of a assistant researcher and doing her best to help, despite the fact that Mary does not want her in the line of fire, and has been trying to kind of push her out in terms of, her presence, just so she can hide her from other elders. Although, Evelyn will not stop helping. So, in the very least, she will try not to be in person all the time, but she will continue to do the research that is necessary for the mission at large. And now that I've gone through the main characters, I do want to quickly go through some characters that were requested by our patrons and our Discord people. If you have any requests for which characters you want me to cover in the next episode of this, because obviously, like I said, there are so many queer characters in Hainai that it would be impossible to cover them all in one episode unless the episode was 3 hours long. So I'm going to cut it up, but I will include the ones that people requested. So the next ones we're going to be talking about are Petja and Drosselmeyer, aka the Puppetmaster, J and Dooley, and Jay's dads, which is an interesting request. And I also wanted to cover the benefactor and his, friend group from the 1920s, 1930s, but I think I will cover that in the next episode, because they are sort of the precursor to Mary's group in an interesting, narrative way, and so I will cover them at the top of the next episode. But for now, I will go into Jay and Dooley, and Petja and Drosselmeyer, and Jay's dads, and then end the episode here. So, Jay was sort of the main character of the 1960s to 1980s portion of the Hainai canon, and the reason I've not gone further into Jay, although I have covered a lot of the things that he's covered, is because I kind of want to do a spin-off of Jay, and I don't know if I can, exhaust all of the stories in the main Hainai canon. I kind of want to make a spin-off story about J and Dooley and sort of explore the stories there, but I don't know when I'll be able to get to that, so we'll see. Probably I'll just start with some bonus episodes and then go from there. Maybe write a novel when Hainai's done or something, I don't know. But I do find Jay to be so interesting and so rife with a lot of stories, and just like Mary, I consider Jay to be pansexual. And I've talked about how Jay would frequent the bathhouses of Toronto, that means he was absolutely sleeping around. Listen, so Jay was very much a free love kind of guy. I think that he was definitely sleeping around with many different people. He had no qualms about any gender, but I do think that all of that was very casual for him. And I do also think that had an impact on his relationship with Dooley, not a negative one necessarily, but one where Dooley saw that Jay was very proudly queer in a time where that was kind of difficult to be, because Jay was very unafraid in many ways, and Dooley felt like the opposite. Dooley felt very much in the closet, but he was still around Jay because he loved Jay, but he would never admit it. That contributed to a very big contrast between Jay and Dooley in their personalities and the way that they addressed their own queerness. Obviously, Dooley was very much in the closet, and he had a good reason to be, because at the time there was a very big state-sanctioned concerted effort to out and to shame and to even arrest queer people. And the fact that Jay was very unafraid to express himself as queer was very unusual for the time, because it was very unsafe to be such. It's just that Jay knew all the ins and outs. He knew how to avoid getting into trouble, even if, he always put himself in a position where he was very much in trouble all the time. He was very good at getting out of it as well. He was very smart, he was very charismatic, and so he was able to sort of weave through that very difficult time in, queer history in Canada. And Dooley, unfortunately, being in law enforcement, had a much harder time to do so, so he never really explored himself as queer until much, much, much later in life. And the political atmosphere is very, very different for queer people, and the very revolutionary people of that era are the reason that Canada has a reputation for being queer-friendly today, but at the time was extremely hostile towards 2S LGBTQIA plus people. And as I've mentioned before, Jay is pansexual, and Dooley is actually gay. And Dooley is gay because he has only ever been in love with Jay while also being attracted to only men, but again, because of his job and also just his upbringing and the family life that he had, he could not admit that to anybody, he could not talk about it, and Jay was the only person he felt free enough to talk about it with. And when Jay was gone, not only did he lose the man that he loved, he also lost a sort of freedom in being true to himself, at least his sexuality around Jay, which is also really sad. And Dooley's story is the one that's very emotional and sweet, and I love Dooley very much. His relationship with Jay meant a lot to me, and similarly, while Jay was sleeping around, while Jay was happily having, casual relationships with people, and while he cared about all those people, the only people he ever truly fell in love with were Dooley and then eventually his wife Marigold. Those are the only two people in his entire life that he was in love with completely. And that is something that I think that is very interesting about Jay, who, despite the fact that he was very open with relationships, he had a lot of really close relationships with people, and he formed a lot of really great bonds while he was in Toronto. Unfortunately, he felt very alienated as well, because of the nature of his work and also his own personality. His personality made it so that a lot of his casual relationships, he showed real care, but the deep and true love only existed in Dooley for many, many years until he and Marigold really had this love story. And that's another thing, by the way. I do plan to tell the story of Marigold and Jay, but for now, it's not part of the main story, and that'll be a spin-off at one point. Maybe a book, I don't know. I really want to tell their story, but just not now. And in that regard, that also means that Jay is polyamorous, with his two loves of his life in his life now, with this wonderfully happy ending that came very late, but still came anyway. And Jay was always polyamorous in the sense that he was sleeping with multiple people at the same time. But that way was more of his free love, free sex ideology than it was about being in love, because again, he only was in love with two people in his entire life. But I don't know if I would say Marigold and Dooley are polyamorous. I mean, I don't really know if I would describe them that way, because they are not together with each other. They are, just together with the same man. And maybe they are in a polyamorous relationship, but their own personal identity may not align with that. But it doesn't really matter, because they are just there for the man that they love and to be happy and to be in this wonderful familial relationship. And of course, Marigold's a welcoming and warm person. And from the beginning, when she and Jay fell in love, she knew that Jay's heart belonged to Dooley. She had known that for a long time, and she never denied how important that was to Jay. It was just that Jay felt like he could never go back, he could never see Dooley again, and Marigold was like, you don't have to live in this sadness, in this self-imposed, despair. your entire life, you can still love somebody and honor them without making your own life just empty and devoid of love. And so that's how Marigold sort of like talked about it with Jay. And Marigold absolutely loves Dooley very much. They do not have any sort of romantic connection between them because, again, Dooley is gay, and that's never been about what Marigold and Dooley are about. But they do adore each other. They are family to each other. And Dooley has always wanted a big family, and Marigold and Jay have given him that. And that's a big part of their relationship. And I think Dooley's identity and relationship as a gay man who has lived his life very closeted, who has not pursued the things that he's wanted the most. He never got to pursue a big family because he missed Jay. He never got to, have the things that he wanted, where he was still very traditional in his mindset, where he still wanted a large family, and at one point would have been willing to perhaps marry a woman and have a family with her just to get that. I think he was true to himself in a way where he could not subject somebody to a false marriage like that. And so instead he lived quite alone for a long time until he met Donner, and Donner became his found family in that way. Even if it's not a big one, it still mattered to him that he had somebody that he could consider family. And so his happy ending up with a much, much larger family through Marigold and Jay is something that I really wanted for him and his character. And it's certainly something that's made me cry a couple of times when I listened to the story. Like, I wrote that thing and I still cried, so, uh, happy Pride. And as an aside, I actually have not thought of the sexuality of Marigold. I do have some idea of her personality and who she was back in the day, but I will cover that in future episodes, so maybe then I'll decide what her sexuality is and what her identity is. But in the meantime, for now, for all intents and purposes of the story, she is cis heterosexual, and that's what it is, for now. Maybe later, that'll change. And a quick shout out to Jay's dads, again, because I want to do a spin-off of Jay. I might go into them more in the future, but for now, I want to say that Jay's dads were two men who fell in love totally in secret, because again, if it was hard in Jay's time, it was definitely way worse in the time of his parents. They basically lived totally in secret. I had this whole idea that they lived in a sort of cramped apartment setup in Toronto, and they did have neighbors who may have known about their relationship, or at least one neighbor that did, but because they took care of each other as this very cramped, close quarters, very poor housing situation, they of course would not out each other, they would not betray each other. In my mind, there was definitely like a female housemate that they had, and they were laborers. Like, the two men who lived together and were in love with each other were laborers and did a lot to sort of support the entire household. And outing them basically meant that their two healthiest, most productive laborers would be gone. So even if the housemates thought they lived in sin or something, they would absolutely not out them or tell anybody about them. And certainly, if I wrote more about them, I could definitely go into the deeper nuances of their relationships with their neighbors. But I do think it would have been a mix of actual affection between neighbors, but also, like, just pragmatism, where they would not out the two people who were earning the most money for their household, and they would absolutely not out them, despite the fact that they were living in sin, quote-unquote. As for where Jay came from, I think I've mentioned it in the show, but maybe I haven't. Basically, Jay's dad and another woman had sex, and then the woman could not handle being a mother, so she gave Jay to his dad, James, who was basically a single dad until Callahan came along. And as I mentioned, Callahan was a very great father. He was a very great da to Jay. Although he was a bit of a drinker, and he had a lot of trauma from Hyde, which, is totally fair, because that was a horror show. And the fact that Callahan was a wonderful dad was a testament to how together he could keep himself after the horrific and horrendous trauma of losing his entire town. After coming back from an equally traumatic war to something he doesn't even know about. Like, Callahan surviving was very much based on his love for his family, his new family, his unofficial husband, his secret husband, and his secret new child. The reason that he kept it together was his family, because otherwise he would just drink himself to death because of all that he's seen and all of the things that he's gone through. And speaking of what he's gone through, I can finally talk about Hyde and Drosselmeyer, aka the Puppetmaster, and their relationship with Petja, the Elder. And I've already gone through this in the Petja episode, but basically Drosselmeyer is a non-binary person. I've never gone into whether they are pansexual or bisexual, and I think the answer is way more interesting than that. I don't know that they would have sought out a romantic relationship if Petja wasn't in the picture. I do think that they love Petja, but not as much as they loved their kid, And I think that their love and sexuality was more responsive than it was active. I think something I never mentioned back in the original story is that they absolutely knew that the horrible and monstrous priest from Hyde was attracted to them, and they used that to their advantage. I think they were absolutely a sexual being, and they knew how to use that, but they had never considered it in the sense of like a proper romantic relationship until Petja came along. They basically use their sexuality as a tool up until a certain point. They use a lot of things as a tool up to a certain point. That's just how their mind works. And while in many cases they use Petja as a tool, the sincerity of their relationship actually did exist. Like, they actually realized that Petja really loved them, and they sincerely reciprocated that love, even if the levels of that love were not equal at all. Because at the end of the day, the Puppet Master only valued two things at the top of their priority list, and one of them was their science and, like their innovations and all the things that they have discovered about their own talents and skills and their tools, and the other one was their children. And so obviously they wanted both Lori and Elaine to be their daughters, but mostly ended up with just Lori, although they poured their love into Lori, all the love that they have, because that's something that they've always wanted, a child. Sort of in a reverse Frankenstein, where Frankenstein was so focused on his innovations that he had no love for the thing that he actually created, whereas Drosselmeyer is the opposite, where their innovations matter so much to them that the one thing that they really wanted was to create a child and have something that was their own creation. And because they could not do that from, a biological standpoint, the child that they did adopt was somebody that they loved with all their heart. And while Petja loved them and so they loved Petja back, the capacity of love they had for Petja was much smaller than it was for Lori. Although that being said, Petja accepted that. Petja was like, yeah, okay. Like, Petja accepted that this person he fell in love with did not love him as much as he loved them, but he accepted that because he loved them too much to have this delusion about the relationship, which is why Petja was such a good lover, and which is why Drosselmeyer wanted to give them true and real love, despite the fact that they could not summon enough love to match the amount of love that Petja was giving them. But that was fine with Petja. It didn't matter to him. He wanted to be a person that was worthy of who Drosselmeyer was, and Drosselmeyer as a person is a very complex and interesting individual who is very capable of love, but whose love is defined a lot by their innovations, their ability to use tools, their ability to use magic, their ability to use their brain in finding and discovering truths about the world that other people have not discovered. And the relationship was absolutely not equal, but at the same time, there was real love there, and it's an exploration that I really had fun with in terms of like mixing horror with romance. It is like a level of romance where one of them is not capable of the love that the other one was giving, but at the same time, that worked out just fine because Petja was not looking for a normal, healthy relationship. He was looking for someone to worship with all the love in his heart who was worthy of that worship, and he found them. And on the other hand, Drosselmeyer loved him because he facilitated a lot of their discoveries about magic and the human body and their abilities as an unofficial elder. And I think that, that's kind of beautiful. Petja really, supported their work so truly and deeply that he let Drosselmeyer experiment on his body. Do surgery on his body to figure out the ways in which elder healing works and just elder magic in general works. And that is something, that's true love. But that's also, not an equal or healthy love, but it is a true love. That is, the ultimate supportive partner. And I think that's why, Drosselmeyer, despite the fact that they never sought out romance in their lives, was very much like, wow, I love my partner who is willing to do all the things so that I can achieve my goals. Even if I don't love him the way that he loves me, I still love him. And that's beautiful. And as for whether Petja had a queer identity, I don't know. I think that he didn't really think about it. I think he just saw the most beautiful person in the world and was like, any preconceived notions I have about my sexuality are out the window because this person is clearly somebody who deserves all my love. Which, good for him. Anyway, speaking of unhealthy queer relationships, we are absolutely going to get into the relationships between the benefactor and his friends and his partners over time in the next episode, so stay tuned for that, and thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, or if you want to suggest characters that I should cover in the next episode, alongside the benefactor and his loved ones back in the day, please do let me know. I'm definitely going to cover other queer characters in Hainai in the next episode, and it might even grow into a third or fourth episode, depending on how long I want to make them. But yeah, I definitely want to talk about Salai and Manfred. I want to talk about all the side characters that I have mentioned in the past as well. And if there's anyone you want to hear about, please let me know. There was also somebody who requested that I talk about my own sexuality and my own identity, and I think I have briefly. I've talked about how I'm pansexual and how I'm queer and I love telling queer stories, but I think I'll go into that deeper in the next episode as well. Thanks so much for listening. Maraming salamat, and I'll see you in the next episode of the queer identities of the Hainai characters. Happy Pride!